After vaccine nationalism, are India and, in fact, countries of the developing world suffering vaccine racism? Hello and welcome to Worldview at the Hindu with me, Suhasini Haidar. This week, we're going to look at one aspect of global inequality. The United Kingdom is actually easing restrictions for travelers from a number of countries beginning October 4th. Now, this will mean they don't have to undergo mandatory quarantines if they belong to those countries and if they have taken a recognized vaccine. Now, interestingly, Indian-made Covishield, the vaccine that's been made by the Serum Institute, is actually on the list of approved vaccines after, of course, a major protest by India on the subject. But India itself is not yet on the list of countries that will be given the exemption. Simply put, if you have been vaccinated in India and a number of other countries, you will have to be quarantined for 10 days and test negative twice in those 10 days in order to be allowed out in the United Kingdom. Now, this is indeed, and I'm just speaking for India here, this is indeed a contrast to January of 2021, when Prime Minister Boris Johnson was expected in India as Republic Day chief guest, and he and Prime Minister Narendra Modi were expected to announce a vaccine partnership using Indian manufacture and British expertise, most notably Covishield, made by Serum Institute under license from AstraZeneca, and they would produce vaccines for the world. At the United Nations as well, Prime Minister Modi said that he remains proud of India's vaccines. He spoke about the DNA vaccines, the mRNA vaccines, and the soon-to-be-out nasal vaccines. Now, the British ruling on this has been taken up by the Indian government already. External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar spoke to his UK counterpart Liz Truss when they were in New York. And after a warning then from Foreign Secretary Harsh Shringla, who called it a discriminatory process, and he said that this would incur reciprocal action from India, the government seems to be set for a battle royale. And it has now said that it too will impose from October the 4th a strict 10-day quarantine, 2 negative test rule on all UK nationals, vaccinated or otherwise, including those of Indian origin who come to India, saying that it will not reconsider this unless the Boris Johnson government reverses its own vaccination and entry policy. So we're going to take all of that apart and start with the first question on discrimination. You might well ask that every country seems to have its own rules when it comes to who can enter and what rules they have to follow. So why is it that the UK is being accused of discrimination in particular? Let's just take a look at those new rules released on September 17th. You can see the link below. The first part is that the UK's categorization of red, amber, and green countries, which will now be merged into one red list, appears to be arbitrary. It allows travelers from ally countries like the United States. Well, remember, there are still several COVID cases there every day, but not so many countries in Asia, in Africa, and South America are allowed to send their travelers without quarantines, which is leading to the question of whether there is a political reason behind this kind of color coding. The second part, the list doesn't just include approved vaccines, which would be perhaps a more empirical marker, but says they must be taken from, quote, a relevant public health body in that country, in the countries that are exempted from the vaccines. Now, this calls into question whether the UK is now going to judge public health systems in each country as well and decide which ones work. The third part, in a series of statements, mostly on Twitter, but also in television interviews, the UK High Commissioner to India, Alex Ellis, even said that the problem is not with the Covishield vaccine, but with the Cowin vaccine certification process. In other words, it is the Indian certification that is in some doubt. Now, the most interesting part about the UK's decision was as it became clear that the United Kingdom itself had, in the early parts of the virus, accepted and administered 5 million doses of the Covishield vaccine donated by India through the International COVAX Alliance. Then suddenly there was a change in rules. The UK amended it to accept Covishield, but that just raised more questions on the political nature of that decision. So how has the UK really explained its position? And obviously no country feels that what they are doing is in any way racist or discriminatory. First, the British government said that it would not accept the Serum Institute of India made Covishield, but then when it made it clear that the Covishield vaccine was already in the system, it said it was that certification process that it was really working on the basis of, and it needed more clarification on the certification process. So nothing wrong with the vaccine, we're looking at the certification process. Then after talks between British NHS, the National Health Service officials, and the Indian CoWIN app officials, they said that actually there are no technical problems with the app, but perhaps some question on the interoperability of the databases. In other words, can the UK access the Indian databases that would allow them at least to be able to verify certificates? Another problem with the vaccine certificates, and certainly this is an Indian problem, is that they didn't carry the date of birth of the passengers, which has now been rectified according and brought in line with the WHO guidelines as well. So you will have a date of birth on your certificate. Of course, many countries, we've heard of people raising eyebrows at immigration about Prime Minister Modi's photograph on the vaccine document being a little confusing, but none have made that objection officially. Behind the scenes, officials have raised questions about the authenticity of Indian vaccine data. In other words, on single days like Yoga Day in June or Prime Minister Modi's birthday in September, when 25 million vaccinations were administered, these were record spikes that were administered on certain days that seem to be out of sync with daily vaccination figures, leading to some questions about whether vaccines were being hoarded for one particular day or they were giving the certificates were showing the wrong dates. There's also been some concern about fake vaccine certificates, but not voiced publicly as of now. And of course, it isn't just the United Kingdom, but other countries that have had rules and rule changes that India has voiced its concerns about. Let's just take a look at what different countries are doing. The United States, for example, has had a very strict travel ban, except for non-essentials. They don't actually allow anyone in, but they have what is called a national interest exemption for officials, for students, for journalists, for anyone who has a health condition or a family problem. And from November the 1st, fully vaccinated travelers will be allowed into the United States without quarantines. At present, though, non-citizens who have been in the United Kingdom, European Union, China, India, Iran, Ireland, Brazil, South Africa, in 14 days before entering the United States, they're not actually being allowed unless, as I said, they have those national interest exemptions. Then we come to Australia. Australia's borders are currently completely closed. Entry to Australia remains strictly controlled for non-citizens. But Prime Minister Morrison has now promised that in the next few weeks, many of those restrictions will be lifted, and they've made it clear that Covishield is actually a recognized vaccine for them. So it remains to be seen when Indians can actually travel there, but there is a possibility of some restrictions being relieved in the next few weeks, according to the Prime Minister. Then you turn to the European Union, and remember there was a big row between India and the EU over what were called green passports that would allow travel within Europe only if you had one of those green passports. A majority of European Union countries, about 18 out of 29, have agreed to accept passengers from India so long as they are vaccinated with Covishield. Covaxin, the other Indian vaccine, is not yet accepted, but an EU Green Pass, as I said, created some worries for India that it could be used in the future to restrict travel from India. Then you go to Russia. Russia accepts Indian nationals based just on the RT-PCR tests, but only those that travel on direct flights to Moscow. China, the most restrictive of them all, has restricted the entry of all Indians with just very, very few specific exemptions. So it means students, businessmen, even Chinese nationals wishing to go back to China for work or otherwise are not necessarily entitled to enter. In fact, Indian ambassador to China, Vikram Misri, has recently said in an interview that this reflected an unscientific approach from China. Now, when it comes to India's own policy on vaccines, there have been some contradictions as well. So I'm going to list those out for you because many countries do accuse India of having very confusing and contradictory messages going out with its policies. To begin with, India imposed very strict travel restrictions itself during the lockdown, and many of those rules that it had put into place still exist. Much of the travel still depends on commercial negotiations between the government and those countries it wants to build those agreements with, to set up what is called an air travel bubble. So there is a hint of political decision making over there. Second, the UK has complained specifically that India still discriminates against passengers from UK, South Africa and Brazil, as they have to undergo 7 days mandatory home quarantines in addition to every other requirement that India has. And you can see some of those guidelines at this link. Now, when it comes to vaccines too, the Indian government has had some contradictions. India requested, for example, US vaccines to be supplied to India, but not one so far has been accepted because India wants American manufacturers, Pfizer, Moderna, Johnson & Johnson, to sign liability statements or indemnity waivers so as to be allowed to supply vaccines to India, and that hasn't happened yet. At the Quad Summit, in fact, in Washington, Prime Minister Modi announced that India would start exporting vaccines, claimed the plan to export 1 billion Johnson & Johnson vaccines to Southeast Asia as part of the Quad is on track, but he hasn't explained just how India will get around the indemnity hurdle. And the government has frequently changed its goalposts while battling EU restrictions. For example, it said countries must accept all nationally issued vaccines and vaccine certificates. So every country should decide what is a proper vaccine, like they do with people's passports. And that would include Covishield and Covaxin. But now it seems for the moment the government is really batting for Covishield acceptance globally. Much will depend on the World Health Organization's own decision on recognizing Covaxin that is due in the first week of October. Now, can India do anything to stop what it sees as discriminatory practices, or in short, vaccine racism? In the case of the United Kingdom, it can push diplomatically with the UK to change its rules before that October 4th deadline. Also, visits are expected by the British Foreign Secretary Liz Truss and UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson to India, and these could be places where India could, in fact, push its leverage. The second is reciprocal measures, as the Foreign Secretary spoke about them, targeting specific countries who treat Indians differently from others, necessary to bring India's own standards in line if it wants to push this kind of tough approach on discriminatory practices. So whether it's on the Co-Win app, certificate, whether Covaxin will be treated on par with Covishield, India's own standards have to be actually standardized, as they say. And the final is really that India must push for global vaccine standards, acceptance across the world of national or the World Health Organization's EUL, emergency use listing standards. And that is something that has been asked at the G20, for example, by Russia and other countries as well, and must be pushed. As with the problem of vaccine nationalism, where each country hoarded vaccines for its own domestic use rather than look at the world more holistically, something that has meant, for example, that many countries in Africa have not even crossed 4% vaccination rates so far. This problem of vaccine racism, acceptance of one vaccine over another, really boils down to a global issue, and that is discrimination and a lack of equality in the world. While the India-UK controversy over vaccine recognition is likely to blow over soon, and that's what it seems from what officials have said, discrimination continues to rear its head in different parts of the world. Now, this is not an issue where I have book recommendations for you, but I can assure you that the Hindu website, www.thehindu.com, has many articles, frequently answered questions as well on this particular issue. But that's all we have time for here on Worldview this week from the team here. Thanks for watching.